Have you ever gotten finally a very big task out of the way and thought, hey, thank God that's over, and then are immediately confronted with an adjacent task that's like way bigger? Yeah, well, welcome to the Imperium.
No!
Hi, I'm Chrono the Harlequin, and welcome back to Live from the Black Library, where today I want to talk to you about the Scouring, and just how insane it was. But before we get into that, I just want to say thank you so much for watching this video. Please subscribe if you have not already done so, and consider supporting me on Patreon to help me make these videos and support my history channel, which is proving to be a little bit expensive given the production quality of the videos. And yes, I am still working on videos. I'm sorry it's taken so long. Also, consider joining my Discord server to keep up with me and all the projects I'm working on. But without further ado, let's get into some of the absolutely insane events of the Great Scouring. Now, the Great Scouring was that period right after the horusheresy where the Imperium counterattacked against the traitor forces, which were reeling after their crushing defeat. And yes, their loss after the Siege of Terra was absolutely crushing. It specifically said in The End and the Death Volume 3 that if the Imperium had at least 1/3 more forces on Terra at the time, while the traitors were still reeling from the death of Horus and the abandonment of the Chaos Powers, then the Siege of Terra would have been a historical footnote to the slaughter of Terra, where every single traitor would have been wiped out by the vengeful Imperials. And trust me, that spirit of vengeance absolutely continues into the Great Scouring. So it would be very interesting to see a reversal of the spirit of the horusheresy, where the traitors felt like they were winning and they were making progress, all while the loyalists were effectively staging a galactic-wide fighting withdrawal and were consistently on the back foot. However, the Great Scouring, the extended campaign conducted by the Imperium's forces to hunt down those traitorous elements that were still active in the galaxy, be them space marine or human, and bring back into the fold all those parts of the Imperium that had either declared independence or simply fallen away with all the chaos and warp storms that had been going on over the course of the war. Now, it should be noted, we have no proper timeline for how long the Great Scouring lasted, because all of the major events that we know of are listed as having happened sometime in M31, and given the horusheresy ended in M14 M31, that gives us a big time space to work with. However, one thing that we do know is that during the Great Scouring, Guilliman was the linchpin that kept the Imperium together and was the driving force both politically and militarily, and is said to have been, quote, everywhere at once, effectively running himself ragged to put everything right and keep everyone on the same page, because he knew he would have to if the Imperium was to survive. This is actually a very interesting part of Guilliman's character that we see in the modern setting. He's a chronic micromanager, but he is trying to get better at delegation and have more faith in people. So I think it might be reasonable to say that the last major event of the Scouring was the Battle of Thessala, which is when Guilliman had his throat cut by the demon Primarch Fulgrim and went into stasis, because with him gone, the Imperium could go into a sort of state of evolution and reforging, where the less politically savvy Primarchs, like Jagatai Khan, would disappear one by one and leave the Imperium in the hands of mortal men, the vast majority of whom had come to embrace the worship of the Emperor as a god and see the orthodoxy arise that would become the Cult Imperialis. Now, the Battle of Thessala took place in M31 121, so the Scouring is like, at minimum, 100-year-long affair, which gives us a lot to work with. And in this time, we would also see not just various battles, but also a lot of political change and reform. The Imperium became a lot harsher, a lot more reactionary. It became a lot more zealous in its worship and faith now that the Emperor was gone and the Primarchs didn't have the ability to tell humanity, no, don't worship him anymore, because it had become so entrenched. Furthermore, there was also Guilliman's reforms of the Codex Astartes, which broke up the Space Marine legions into chapters of 1,000 to stop any one group of Space Marines becoming too powerful if they rebelled, and reforms to the Imperial Army, which saw itself broken in two between the Imperial Navy and the Imperial Guard. This was because Even though the focus was on the traitor Space Marines, traitorous army units, Titan units, navy units, and auxilia were a huge problem and caused so much havoc. And Guilliman wanted to make sure no traitorous commander could have enough resources at their command to cause a large rebellion. Because back in the day, if a leader of an expedition during the Horus Heresy wanted to rebel, they had the army, they had navy units, they had everything they needed. But now, if a navy unit wanted to rebel, the army might not be on side, and if an army unit wanted to rebel, the navy wouldn't be on side and wouldn't be able to transport them anywhere. So breaking the Imperial Army into the Imperial Navy and Guard respectively was a very prudent choice. And this period also saw the honestly more or less extinction of the Solar Auxilia, those elite humans who had sort of led the charge of the Great Crusade alongside the Space Marines. It's all very interesting. However, what you're really here for are the battles of Space Marines, and these are events that we've heard alluded to several times in the lore and even seen from some perspective in some form or another in the books, such as the Battle of Thessala, with Guilliman coming back in the Plague Wars series, where he reminisces on that battle and that clash with Fulgrim that saw him taken out of action. However, one battle I desperately want to see would be the Battle of the Iron Cage, which is when the Iron Warriors, led by Perturabo, built an impenetrable fortress on the planet of Sebastus IV called the Eternal Fortress, and challenged the Imperial Fists to come and dig them out of it. To which Dorn said, "I will drag Perturabo to Terra in an iron cage." And the reason they could do something like this is because they quit the Siege of Terra partway through after Perturabo finally realized that this is no longer the war between the Legions and Primarchs and is about chaos versus the Imperium, a war he didn't want to be a part of anymore. So, his forces were spared the bulk of the slaughter that occurred at the end of the siege. So, he had one of the strongest legions. So while it would be awesome to finally see those two legions, the Imperial Fists and the Iron Warriors, slug it out face to face with no distractions, what's more interesting in my mind would be to see how Dorn and Perturabo have both changed. Because the last time we saw them interact was near the end of the book, The First Wall, after the first layer of defenses on Terra had fallen, and Perturabo said to Dorn, "You know, you and I could just slug it out here in the dirt, but that would not prove I'm better than you." And Dorn said, "You know, maybe you slug it out in the dirt, but I'm an expert swordsman. And besides, this is just the first wall." To which Perturabo responds, "See you on the next wall, brother." It's clear Perturabo still absolutely has an axe to grind against Dorn, and Dorn probably has a lot of steam he needs to blow off after the end of the Siege of Terra, where he carried the Emperor's dying body to the Golden Throne. He went through so much at the end of the siege there, it's honestly mind-boggling. So seeing him, very likely traumatized, battered, reduced, and angry, while Perturabo has had time to refine himself, mature quite a bit as we see at the end of the Siege of Terra, and finally get the thing he wants, finally get a real win in, would be incredibly interesting. Because it also should be noted that after the Battle of the Iron Cage, Perturabo ascended to Demon Princehood, and that is something that is set up in The End and the Death Volume 3, when Perturabo is basically thinking to himself after having evacuated Terra. He's thinking, you know, no matter who wins this war, my legion is going to be hunted, and if I'm going to be stronger, I need to utilize every tool I can. I need to become a weapon in its purest sense, basically setting up him becoming a Demon Prince of Chaos Undivided, something we know that he has done. And interestingly, in the 42nd millennium, we see some snippets of Demon Primarch Perturabo talking to Hansu on the planet of Medringard, after Hansu has had his whole back and forth with Uriel Ventress, after he's escaped his invasion of Ultramar. Basically, he's back at the starting point. He meets with Perturabo, and they basically play a game of Warhammer together, where Perturabo basically tells Hansu, your life is more or less on the line in these games, let's see how you do. And Perturabo reveals himself to actually be incredibly chill. He compliments Hansu on his abilities, gives him some life advice, and basically says to him, the reason you lost against Ventress and the Ultramarines was because they could predict you. You're too emotional, and they could use that to play you even though you had all the advantages. To which Hansu replies, hey, haven't you done the same thing? Let your emotions dictate your actions? And Perturabo, instead of lashing out or getting angry, just says, oh yeah, totally, I've done that lots of times, and it never works out well for me, kid. What we've seen of his character arc transformation is absolutely fascinating, and it absolutely does deserve its own video at some point, because his entire character arc is literally just him growing up. And that's the thing I find really interesting, getting to see that evolution, or at least the beginnings of it, of the legions and the Primarchs from what they were to what they will eventually become, seeing them finally start to calcify into their new forms. And this is also true for the Primarchs we maybe don't get to see much of anymore, an example of that being Vulkan, because Vulkan actually does something very interesting during the Great Scouring, which is his last major action before vanishing and reappearing during the War of the Beast, only to vanish again. That being the hunt for Fabius Bile. Vulkan learns about everything Fabius Bile did while on Terra, all his horrible experiments on civilians, and decides to bring him to justice no matter what, and effectively ends up running him down across the galaxy, running into his fortresses, his thralls, his minions and abominations over and over again, with him proving to be very slippery with the help of the Dark Mechanicum, even setting up some traps for the salamanders, only for him to eventually be cornered on a planet and assaulted by Vulkan and his fire drakes personally. He would, however, give them the slip and be able to escape into the warp, though not before his ship was fired upon and damaged. What is really interesting about this to me is the fact that, one, I want to see more of Fabius Bile because he's being shaped up as a mainline character, a principal antagonist in the current setting, what with the release of the book Genefather basically reaffirming that yes, the stuff that happened in the Fabius Bile trilogy is here to stay, and so is he. And I want to see how this weighs on Vulkan, because he did in fact fail to bring Bile to justice and avenge his victims on Terra, something that might weigh heavily on him, particularly given what he had to do and authorize at the very end of the siege. You see, what Vulkan had to do was be in charge of the throne room and have his thumb literally on the button that would destroy the planet if it came to it and Horus defeated the Emperor, which he almost did do. And he was the one feeding thousands of souls to Malcador to keep him alive on the throne, something that was very difficult for him. Malcador, even through his haze of pain and while being basically obliterated on the molecular level, comments on this, sympathizing with Vulkan, saying, oh, my poor boy, this must be so hard for you, given his character, and thinks that it had to be Vulkan to do this because he's the one who truly understands the weight of what is being asked, as opposed to someone like Dorn who's going to just sign off on it because it has to be done. So this, coupled with the fact that he had to help inter the Emperor on the throne, this is going to weigh on Vulkan a lot. And him losing Fabius Bile like this, which in all likelihood would feel like him losing his chance to atone and avenge the people of Terra, could very likely throw him into a sort of depression, if you will. And he wouldn't be the only one, with other Primarchs like Corvus Corax and Leman Russ falling into seemingly depressive states before disappearing from the galaxy. Corax, as we know, descended into the Eye of Terror, leaving his legion alone in order to hunt down traitors himself, while Leman Russ would leave the galaxy in M31-211, where he told his assembled legion that he would return during the final battle, aka the Wolf Time, and took his best warriors with him into supposedly the Eye of Terror. Think about that for a second. M31-211, nearly 200 years after the end of the horusheresy, we're really dealing with some massive timescales here. And even then, Jagatai Khan would disappear in M31-84 into the Maelstrom and then eventually the Webway chasing Drukhari. We're dealing with a timescale here so much wider than the horusheresy, which means there's so much more room for development and growth with not just the Primarchs, but also their legions. And I think one legion that serves as a great example of this is the Blood Angels. The last we saw of them was the entire legion collectively losing their minds after Sanguinius died, the first instance of the Black Rage. But now that the siege is over, they have to reconcile the existence of this new second curse already on top of the existing Red Thirst. That's horrible. and they have to navigate both of those curses without the calm, kind, tempered guiding hand of their immaculate Primarch. That is so difficult, and again, it would be really interesting to see how the Legion reconciles this. And it also brings to attention the second founding, because this isn't just the chapters just saying, well, guess we're splitting up the gang, bye-bye everyone. No, after all they had been through and suffered together through the Great Crusade and then the Heresy, there is no doubt that the breaking of the legions into chapters was a hard and deeply painful experience for the legions involved. And sure, in the early days, there was a fair bit of inter-chapter cooperation between those with shared gene lineages, but it would be super interesting to see who takes these changes in stride and who is more resistant and feels almost lost having left their mother legion, especially since the chapter masters of a lot of those legions are characters we had been following since the Heresy. Marines like Nasir Ahmet, the founder of the Flesh Terrors, and Alexis Pollux, the founder of the Crimson Fists. Catching up with them would be super interesting. And of course, Sigismund, the founder of the Black Templars, because he was very important in leading the charge during the Scouring, but he kind of fell from grace by the time the first Black Crusade rolled around in the 700s M31. By that time, the High Lords were ignoring him, thinking, oh, there's crazy old Sigismund guarding the Eye of Terror, they're never coming back. But of course, they were wrong. And we would also get to see people who founded chapters in the first founding that we've never heard of. Someone like Sasebo Tezuka, who was the founder of the Mortificators, which are a really weird Ultramarine successor chapter in that they are very spiritual, believe the Emperor was a god, and are completely feral lunatics. In fact, Sasebo Tezuka is said to have found the homeworld of the chapter, Posel, by using the Emperor's tarot. He followed tarot cards to find this feral night world and built a chapter off it. Yet we've never heard of him throughout the Heresy. That would be so interesting to see who he is and what he's been doing both before, during, and after the Heresy, because this man is an Ultramarine. So it really makes you wonder how someone like him ended up as an Ultramarine even after all the psycho-indoctrination, and how a chapter like the Mortifactors came about. And between you and me, I just really like the Mortifactors and really want to see more of them because they're so cool, but they get ignored quite a bit. Also, when I say this would likely be a very turbulent and painful experience for the Space Marines, is because we've already seen something like this happen in the lore. When the Unnumbered Sons, that being those new Primarchs Marines which had not yet been integrated into the legions for the first time, were broken up as a cohesive unit and sent their separate ways. Some were excited to get on with their new assignments and meet their new chapters, such as this one who was of Space Wolves gene stock. However, many were very reluctant to actually go. They had formed memories and bonds of brotherhood with each other that they didn't want to let go of. Heck, I recently just finished university, and even that was very emotionally hard for me. I didn't really have anyone to say goodbye to, but saying goodbye to the building and the institution and just that part of my life was very difficult and very heartfelt for me. So I could imagine for a Space Marine, whose legion was their entire identity and with whom they had gone through so much, even if it was just an Ultramarine who hadn't been through as much during the Heresy. But still. However, speaking of the Ultramarines, another big battle they took part of during the Scouring was the Battle of Eskrador. And this is another one that I am immensely interested in because of the presence of the Alpha Legion. Now, there used to be some debate as to whether or not this battle even happened, because according to the Index Astartes, a very old source mind you, the Inquisitor who told people about that battle and who was in charge of Alpha Legion information was revealed to possibly have been an Alpha Legion plant and kind of went dark. However, in more recent books like Sons of the Hydra by Rob Sanders and Harrowmaster by Mike Brooks, it's been all but confirmed that yes, the Battle of Eskrador did in fact happen, and it is unknown even to the Alpha Legion died at the end of the battle or simply used it as a cover to fake his own death so that the Legion could scatter. I would actually like to say this is one I think would be better if we didn't see the actual battle, because I think the ambiguity is much more interesting. Hearing different Alpha Legionnaires' thoughts on the matter, having them debate about it, that sort of thing. I think this is one that shouldn't be touched. Don't show us the Battle of Eskrador. One battle I would like to see more of, though, is the Battle of Exyrion, because this is a battle that had the Dark Angels straight out of the Heresy and straight after the destruction of Caliban, fighting the Iron Warriors on the hive world of Exyrion. And this battle was apparently enormous, allegedly being the largest battle since the Battle of Prospero, which had like almost 2 entire legions in the field. Most battles in the Horus Heresy did not contain entire legions, but this battle was huge, all the way up until the point of including at least one Warlord-class Titan. And the reason the Dark Angels were so intent on engaging this fight was because the Iron Warriors were being aided by some of the Fallen. This is basically what you could consider the start of the Fallen arc after the fall of Caliban, thereby setting up what they would become in the intervening millennia. And this battle would end in effectively a stalemate because when it was going against them, the Iron Warriors would set off a giant warp-based weapon that was so powerful it killed 1 billion people in a single stroke and caused a psychic warp storm in the Califrax cluster, the region of space where this planet was located, that cut it off from the Imperium for 10,000 years. Now, that sounds really bad, but it could be worse. Allow me to introduce you to the Carnage of Morox. Now, the Carnage of Morox was a very large battle that actually included no Space Marines, which is something that I think we should see more of. In fact, this was a battle between the forces of the Imperial Army and the traitor forces that started not during the Great Scouring, but actually about halfway through the Heresy in 009 M31, and it would last all the way up until M31 53. Okay, some context. During the Horus Heresy, the Imperial Army and Traitor Army elements fought over the world of Morox Exilus, which was the capital world of an entire sector. However, that same sector would be cut off from the rest of the galaxy by a warp storm, leaving both sides stranded and without ability to properly resupply. So, their technology and equipment began to degrade over the course of this 44-year-long conflict. And given the fact that this war was of such little strategic influence and was cut off by a warp storm, the rest of the galaxy basically forgot this was going on and just let them have at it. And it wouldn't just be their technology that deteriorated over the course of this conflict, but also more or less their entire social structures. You see, units would be crushed, formed, reformed over and over again, and start forming their own new religions, with the Loyalists, that being the 7,985th Solar Auxilia Armored Cohort, yeah, the army was that big during the Great Crusade, founding an imperial cult, which worshipped those few machines that they had, which still properly worked, as expressions of the Emperor's divinity and him as a deity. So they literally started Emperor worship independently of the rest of the galaxy, simply because there was no one around to tell them not to. I think it kind of gives credence to the notion that the worship of the Emperor was always going to happen, and the Emperor fundamentally misunderstood what people are like. And I think part of the reason they started worshipping those machines was because their frame of reference for the Emperor's divinity was the cult Mechanicus, so they just kind of defaulted to that, and the traitors for their part basically did what all traitors eventually would end up doing, forming chaos cults and summoning demons to help them on the battlefield. Again, it's not particularly important to either the Heresy or the Scouring, but I think it serves as a very poignant and interesting sideshow to the wider anarchy of both of those conflicts. Oh yeah, and 3 billion people died. For a very quick frame of reference, roughly 23 million people died on the higher end per year on average in World War II. Multiplying that by 44 gets about 1 billion. So this conflict would have been about 3 times as deadly for soldiers and civilians as World War II. But if you want a really interesting conflict, look no further than the Scouring of the Nostramo sector. Now, it is known that the planet of Nostramo was destroyed by Konrad Curze himself, when he basically threw a hissy fit and fired a missile into the crater he made when he first landed, after finding out that it had basically descended into madness after he left. However, the entire sector still needed to be purged because the Night Lords, who had largely been absent from the Siege of Terra, were holed up there. I think about a third of the Legion tops was actually at Terra, so the Legion had definitely taken a big beating, but there was still a lot of them kicking around, and it seems like most of them were concentrated around the Nostramo sector. So a combined force of the Blood Angels and Ultramarines set out, armed with large amounts of previously forbidden Exterminatus-grade weapons, in order to basically deal with the problem. You know, they were about to go full Dark Angels on the entire sector. However, when they got there, they encountered almost no resistance getting to the sector and in its outskirts. In fact, according to their estimations, it seemed like only a third of what the Night Lords had remaining by estimation was present in the sector, and you would expect all of them to have congregated here. And what they did find was already disorganized and largely unsupported. Basically, they went in and already found the place seemingly ransacked, and they just did not buy it at all. In fact, the entire invasion force withdrew from the system to a nearby remote base and decided to plan their next move because they were so sure this was a trick of some kind. And they sent, for 6 months, various recon teams to try and find anything. But they found nothing. No hidden ambushes, no warriors, no stockpiles, nothing. And the only conclusion they could come up with was, nope, it's not a trick, somebody just got here before we did and got them hard. And, even though it's never confirmed, it's generally believed that this was done by the Ashen Claws, that being the 18th Company of the Raven Guard, who had earlier on been effectively banished from the Legion by Corvus Corax. This is because they were Terran-born Space Marines, whose culture differed quite a bit from the Raven Guard that Corax was building, and thusly seemed unrehabilitatable. Because they were very brutal and used a lot of fear tactics. They seemed to have more in common, ironically, with the Night Lords than the Raven Guard, and Corax just sent them away on their own errand in the Ghoul Stars, hoping they would eventually just die out on their own. It kinda speaks to a character trait of Corvus Corax that doesn't get talked about as much, and it's the fact that he's a very uncompromising person. But I digress. What makes this really interesting is the fact that apparently these Ashen Claws still exist through to the 42nd millennium, even though their gear is often very run down because they don't ever liaison with the rest of the Imperium. And they are also rumored to have apparently been the genetic precursors to the Carcharodons, which when you think about it makes a lot of sense. And those are just a few of the events from the Great Scouring that we know of. I'm sure there's a lot more that just hasn't been put to lore yet, but whether or not GW should actually expand on what we have of the Great Scouring is up for debate. But what do you guys think? Do you guys think the Great Scouring is actually incredibly interesting and would like to see more of it? Or do you think it's more of just a lore stopgap that had to happen, and that with the end of the Horus Heresy, that era is better left to lie? I'd love to hear what you guys have to say in the comments below. Please subscribe if you have not already done so, and consider supporting me on Patreon if you can, or joining my Discord server, link below. And until then, I will see you in the next video.